and then a father in despair. And what is it that's going to cause him to be in such despair in the midst of this great victory against the Ammonites? Yes, he made a vow without thinking through the possible consequences of his rash statements. And even though it kind of turned out to be something he was not expecting, when you make a vow, God expects you to pay it. And so we're going to be looking at how he carried that out. There's a real controversy about it, and hopefully we'll have a good discussion. And then I want us to look at chapter 12, where he has to basically defend himself against the tribe of Ephraim, who's mad that they got left out of the spoils and the glory of this victory. And so there's civil war. 42,000 Ephraimites are going to fall, and partially because they had a lisp and had trouble pronouncing a word which gave them away, which I find rather interesting. But any rate, what problems do you see with Jephthah's rash vow? Let's go ahead and read this. This comes from Judges 11. And let's get our feel for this. Let's begin at verse 30. And Jephthah vowed a vow unto Jehovah and said, if thou wilt indeed deliver the children of Ammon into my hand, then it shall be that whatsoever cometh forth from the doors of my house to meet me, when I return in peace from the children of Ammon, it shall be Jehovah's, and I will offer it up for a burnt offering. So Jephthah passed over unto the children of Ammon to fight against them, and Jehovah delivered them into his hands. And he smote them from the Ariar until they came to Mernith, even 20 cities, and unto another place I can't pronounce, with a very great slaughter. So the children of Ammon were subdued before the children of Israel. And Jephthah came to Mizpah unto his house, and behold, his daughter came out to meet him with timbrels and with dances. And she was his only child. Besides her, he had neither son nor daughter. And it came to pass when he saw her that he rent his clothes and said, Alas, my daughter, thou hast brought me very low, and thou art one of them that trouble me. For I have opened my mouth unto Jehovah, and I cannot go back. And she said unto him, My father, thou hast opened thy mouth unto Jehovah. Do unto me according to that which hath proceeded out of thy mouth. For as much as Jehovah hath taken vengeance for thee on thine enemies, even on the children of Ammon. And she said unto her father, Let this thing be done for me. Let me alone 2 months, that I may depart and go down upon the mountains and bewail my virginity. It's interesting, she doesn't say bewail my death. She says, bewail my virginity, I and my companions. And he said, Go. And he sent her away for 2 months, and she departed, she and her companions, and bewailed her virginity upon the mountains. And it came to pass at the end of 2 months that she returned unto her father, who did with her according to the vow which he had vowed, and she knew not man. And it became a custom in Israel that the daughters of Israel went yearly to celebrate the daughter of Jephthah the Gileadite 4 days every year. Kind of a fascinating story. So, what problems do you see with this vow, which we usually talk about is rash vow, because it certainly was. So what are your thoughts about this in general? Where did he go awry? Yes, Les.
I guess he might have thought a dog or some animal might come out, as happens when visitors or people come up to a house sometimes. You open the door and a dog rushes out, kind of thing. He maybe thought that was what.
Yeah, well, back in this day, it was very common to keep sheep as pets. And he probably thought, one of my favorite, sheep's going to come out. That was a common animal that was used for a sacrifice. So that's probably in that culture what he thought. A dog would have been considered an unclean sacrifice. So remember that even when you talk about making a sacrifice unto Jehovah, you could only use a clean animal. You couldn't use an unclean animal. So even in that sense, there were restrictions upon this as far as the sacrifice that Jehovah would accept. All right, so that's an interesting thought. Okay, somebody else. Yes, Chase.
On that same note, if it's against, the law to sacrifice a dog to God, I imagine it would also be to sacrifice a human.
Yes, in fact, we're going to look at the text in Leviticus where it specifically says, don't even think about offering up one of your own seed as a sacrifice, as the pagans do. You're not to be like a pagan. And so, but he said, whatsoever comes out. He could have specified whatever acceptable animal comes out. The problem is, he said whatsoever, which is generic and could have been either one. That's where he got himself into trouble. Yes, Pat.
I think it goes deeper than what came out of his house. I think it goes to why was he vowing to God and making rash vows to God? Why was he not just trusting God to do what was right?
Yes. God had already told him he would do what? Yeah, he would use him and he would be victorious. And once again, they're outnumbered in these situations and outgunned. And so they're like Gideon was. They're frightened. They know that Jehovah's the only way they could have this victory. And so he's walking along, he's on his way to the battle, and he decides to say this. What does that imply? If you do this, then I'll do this. So seems like he's trying to bargain with God. I'm going to induce you, as if God would really care so much about him offering up a sacrifice. By the way, I think sometimes we forget what the competing theology was to the truth. Pagan theology, sorcery, was always about doing something to please the gods in order to manipulate them to do your bidding. That's the idea of abracadabra or the magic wand. That's the essence of sorcery. And all this fertility worship, this immorality that they would do, literally in the temple in front of the gods, was the idea that the gods were carnal, earthy, and that you could do something in their presence that would excite them and please them, and therefore, out of appreciation, they will give you bountiful harvest and appropriate rainfall and all of those kind of things. And so, God says, I'm going to use you to give victory for my people, and you can count on me. I'm going to give you victory. And then he comes along with this idea. There's a sense in which he's fallen into this idea that God can be manipulated. That if you'll go ahead and actually do what you promised, then I'll do this for you. So I think this writer says, the vow seems to indicate a lack of faith in the outcome of the battle and that God needed some sort of inducement to give them the victory. And this is a sort of manipulation, I think, that shows a weakness on Jephthah's part. However, when he comes back and he sees his daughter, he doesn't just say, well, God wouldn't expect me to follow through with this, or this isn't what I had in mind. I mean, he does have enough respect for Jehovah that he wants to in some way follow through with what he promised, because after all, God gave him the victory. And as was mentioned earlier, it assumes that it would have been an animal that would have come out to greet him. He should not have made a rash vow that might include a person. Remember, James 1:19 says that we're always supposed to be swift to hear, slow to speak, right? And slow to wrath. And so he wasn't slow to speak here, was he? He just sort of, I guess, in a moment again of lacking faith, trusting in God, thought, well, if he really comes through, I'm going to really do this something nice for him. Now, Jephthah took his vow seriously, and this is sort of similar to me to what we read about under Joshua and the Gibeonites. A little different, but in that case, they got tricked, and they made an alliance with one of these Canaanite nations they were supposed to wipe out without inquiring of Jehovah first. And when they realized they'd been tricked, what did the princes of Israel think they had the right to do? Just ignore their vow and go ahead and wipe them out, because we shouldn't have made the vow to begin with. And Joshua says, we better inquire of Jehovah and see what God wants us to do, because we made this vow by his name. And then what does God tell them? Basically says, your reasoning and my reasoning are not the same. And you did make it in my name. You shouldn't have, but now that you did, you made your bed, you lie in it. I expect you to keep it. And hundreds of years later, when King Saul goes in and kills a bunch of these Gibeonites, it says for the zeal of Jehovah, realizing that this was the original plan because they were wicked Canaanite people, the land has to go through a famine for a number of years and deal with some of the curses of the covenant. And David asked why, and he says, because you violated the commitment you made when you came into the land with the Gibeonite people in my name. So God remembers about our vows and our commitments. Somebody just mentioned to me recently that they were looking at their wedding vows and they didn't mean anything to them anymore. And so they were just going to go ahead and get a divorce, even though there was no grounds. And, I felt like saying, well, they may not mean anything to you, but they still mean something to God, and you made those vows before God and many witnesses. And so when we make a promise to someone, God hears, and the Bible says that we're going to be judged based upon even every idle word that we speak. We're going to have to give an account of in the day of judgment. So this is very interesting. In Psalm 15, verse 4, it talks about the Zion dweller. Who is it that will dwell in Zion or dwell in God's presence? Sometimes people think of this as like the heaven dweller. And one of the comments it says there about character is it says, he who swears to his own hurt and changes not. You make a commitment that you wish you hadn't made. Maybe it's tougher than you thought or whatever, like in a bad marriage or a marriage that's gone bad. The Zion dweller says, well, I made the commitment, I made the vow, I got to keep it. I took out a loan, I signed a promissory note, the value of the house went down, I'm upside down. You can walk and probably get away with it. Or you can say, I still need to pay this debt because I made a promise and I need to keep it. So Jephthah took his vow seriously. How did the daughter take the vow? What was her spirit?
She recognized that he made a vow and he needed to keep it.
Yeah, so she has a respect for God instead of saying, what? Are you kidding me? In fact, she submitted herself to this, whatever you think it was. She submitted herself to this and went along with her father because of her respect for Jehovah. So I got to show a lot of respect for this daughter. She took this very, very seriously. Do unto me according to that which thou hast proceedeth out of thy mouth. For as much as Jehovah hath taken vengeance for thee on thine enemies, even on the children of Ammon. So, what is the significance here, you think, of her being Jephthah's only daughter? Later on we're going to talk about Isban of Bethlehem, who had 30 sons and 30 daughters, and Abdon, the son of Hillel, had 40 sons and 30 sons that rode on 70 donkeys. So there's these other judges that had all of these children. Now, we don't really know why at this point Jephthah just has this one. And it's also interesting that, especially in a day when you can have a multiplicity of wives, why he didn't later on, if his wife's not around, figure out some way to have offspring. But clearly, that didn't happen to Jephthah. So the fact that this woman is his only daughter, his only offspring, and it's very clear that they're bewailing her virginity, that it's not just her death that's involved here, but the fact that his lineage is dead. And the blessings that go throughout your prodigy in ancient Israel, remember the whole idea of the Jubilee is that every 50 years, your family's land gets returned to you, even if you lost it in foreclosure. And so all that's gone. And so this is one of the reasons why this is such a sad story and such a rash vow. It's because it wasn't just what happened to his daughter, but what happened to his whole lineage, his whole name in Israel. So the seed is dead. So I think that's an important part of this story that is sometimes overlooked. Do you think Jephthah killed his only daughter, or did he just not give her to marriage? Remember, in the Bible, animals, if they're clean animals, are sacrificed to God. Humans are sanctified in some way to God. What happened with Hannah and Samuel, for example? In this case, she's begging for a child. She doesn't want to be barren. And she pledges to God, if you'll just let me have this child, I won't even keep it for myself. I'll give it to you in service. Now, in this case, Samuel was able to later have a family, but he was given over to Eli to live in the proximity of the tabernacle and to serve the Lord there in some special way in the tabernacle. So Samuel was sanctified, and she went home. She visited him and gave him a coat. Remember that touching story every year and all that? And then later, of course, the Lord blessed Hannah with multiple other children as well. So when I think about that and all the emphasis in the text on her bewailing her virginity and that kind of thing, it seems to me that there was some way that she was going to be sanctified for the Lord's service and that she wouldn't be able to get married. But Judges 11, verse 39 said, he did with her according to his vow. And technically, what did he say? What was his vow?
Burnt offering.
Yeah. He didn't just say, I'll dedicate it to you, God. He said, I'll offer up as a burnt offering. Some writers, some commentators believe that this is just simply an example of them behaving like the Ammonites that they defeated, because the Ammonites were well known for child sacrifice. The Moabites worshiped Chemosh, and the Moabites worshiped Molech, and the Ammonites worshiped Chemosh, and those are the two gods that specifically were set up with these heated arms where you would sort of roast the child as you gave it up to sacrifice. And as Chase was indicating, though, I mean, there are some things that goes without saying, but in Leviticus 18:21, in the law of the priest and the book there that they were given to deal with all the sacrifices, he says, never offer up your seed as a sacrifice. Common among the pagans, but not among God's people. Some say, well, this couldn't have been true because God wouldn't have been pleased with this. Judges 11:29, right before this incident, it says the Spirit of the Lord came upon him. Well, it certainly came upon him and enabled him to have this great victory against the Ammonites and later on against the Ephraimites. But the Spirit of the Lord came upon Samson too, and he did a lot of immoral things he shouldn't have done. Didn't mean you take away someone's free moral agency. And so there are times where these people are doing things they shouldn't be doing, even though they're carrying out God's will and they're an instrument of God's redemption. And let's not forget, Jephthah is mentioned in Hebrews 11 as one of the people we should look up to as a person of faith. So, I don't know for certain, but it just seems to me, he'd offered up his own daughter in a pagan sacrifice. He wouldn't be in Hebrews 11. That's just my thoughts about this. But it could be that this is just another example of the people becoming like the pagans round about them. Go ahead, Les.
Well, I looked up Leviticus 18:21, and the sacrifice there is not to be made, give your children up to Molech. And so this is kind of a little bit different if you sacrifice them to the true God. Maybe that's how you get around it, I don't know. But, you know, like you said, the practice of sacrificing to these man-made gods and so forth was not sanctioned, not like, anything.
Specifically prohibited and explained as one of the reasons why God was going to destroy both Israel and Judah, because they fell into this. So,
Jephthah giving up his daughter to sacrifice her to God, the true God and so forth, is a little bit different than what Leviticus 18:21 says, I think, anyway.
okay.
You know,
Yeah, I think there's sort of a generic statement, and then the other is given as a specific example. Don't offer up your seed, and then especially he mentions don't participate in this pagan practice. Yes,
I
Todd.
was gonna say, I mean, the verse 40 kind of says they have that commemoration each year for 4 days. So wouldn't that imply that it did happen? Seems to me, unless it's like maybe a legend of some sort. Or,
Oh, no, something happened. We're not sure whether they're commemorating her sacrifice. This was her willing sacrifice and her service to God in some way. You know, that the little phrase that he did to her according to her vow sounds like some specific act, which is why some people think he actually killed her. And again, I'm just, something about it, I'm just skeptical. And so I don't know for sure. Yes, and it certainly wouldn't have been pleasing to God. So if the whole point is trying to keep your vow to God, you don't please God by keeping a vow that directly violates his law. Yes, Gene.
Well, we know that God was going to have Abraham sacrifice Isaac. He did not follow through with that, but he did follow through with sacrificing his own son. So there is a certain type of human sacrifice that God would condone, but that he also would not condone. So if it's to Molech, definitely not, but nothing is to be idolized to a foreign god, regardless of what it is. So
Yeah.
certainly it would be a sacrifice included. But if God was to sacrifice his own son, that's different. So it's not the sacrificing in and of itself, it's the who is it offered to and what's the purpose of it.
Yes, and let's keep in mind, when you talk about God offering up his son, Jesus did this on his own volition because he was willing to do this to be our Savior. So someone rushing in to take a bullet for somebody else as an act of heroism voluntarily, which is really what Jesus did for us as he bore our sins, is not the same as somebody else deciding, well, I'm going to sacrifice this person against their will. That's what happens to these little babies when you worship unto Molech. So the reason why we love Jesus is because he was in on all this. This was a part of the plan from the beginning. And so, yeah, those are fascinating things to think about. Ecclesiastes 5. Yes, Chase.
I say it wasn't against your will if you said, go ahead.
Yeah, it wasn't. That's why they celebrate her, because she went along with this. I think it probably has something to do with her being dedicated in some special way to serve. Maybe the tabernacle was still around in this day, kind of similar to what happened with Samuel. I just wish we had more information. But one thing we can, yeah, go ahead, Pat.
The Torah denotes that the firstborn is always redeemed. So maybe this is his way of redeeming her by putting her in the service of the Lord.
Mm-hmm. Possibly. That's a thought. But the lesson we need to learn from this is, be not rash with thy mouth, and let not thine heart be hasty to utter anything before God. For God is in heaven, and thou art upon earth, therefore let thy words be few. So, Don't rush down to the altar to make a lifelong vow until death do us part, for better or for worse, unless you really counted the cost and really thought through what you're doing. And on so many different levels, we need to be careful before we make commitments. Yes, Jennifer?
When I first read it, I just thought that Jephthah was being compulsive in making that, and like he was being enthusiastic, like, oh, I know you're going to give me this, but I'm so happy I'll sacrifice the first thing that comes out of my door. And so I just thought he was being overly enthusiastic and compulsive at the same time.
Yeah, but he didn't say, I know you're going to do this for me, therefore when I come back. That's not what he said. He said, if thou will indeed do this, then I'll do that.
Yeah.
See, so that's where the doubt comes in. He's got the if instead of the assurance. But all of us need to really think through, these principles in the Bible that tell us that, if you make a commitment, God expects you to keep your commitments. When words are many, sin is not absent, but he who holds his tongue is wise. One translation here in Proverbs 10:19 says, with the abundance of words, transgression abounds. So all need to be very mindful of just running off at the mouth and saying things we don't mean. We were talking about this subject when I was preaching at the church in San Diego, and one of the deacons there raised his hand, and he was all upset. He goes, do you mean to say that if I get upset and I say, man, this car is giving me nothing but trouble, I'm not going to ever buy another Chevrolet again? Are you saying that just because I say that in a moment of frustration that I'd be sinning if I bought a Chevrolet? And I said, yes, I am.
Yeah.
And he goes, that's ridiculous. And all these other people raised their hand, and boy, did we ever have a discussion about that. And everybody gave all these examples of times they've said things to their kids, I'm going to wring your neck, I said, I would not say that if you don't intend on doing it. You just made my point. And so we live in a culture that's very loose with their words, and if you change your mind later, it doesn't matter. What did Jesus warn us? For by your words you will be justified, and by your words you will be condemned. So that's a big thing that we're going to have to deal with in judgment. And I like what he says here. He says, I tell you, on the day of judgment, people will give an account for every careless word they speak. Well, swearing that you're never going to buy another Chevrolet again is kind of a careless word. It's not that big a deal to have to follow through with that vow anyway, right? But sometimes people say things and they just don't take it seriously enough. My mom and dad growing up, it was really hard, especially to get, I remember my dad, promise, kids will do that. My dad will shake his head, mom would shake her head. Make promises sparingly and keep them faithfully. You got that? If I say yes, I've got to follow through with that. And I was talking to my mom about that just today, because she said, I'm looking forward to your judges class tonight. It's really nice to know, Mom, that you're listening. And she's probably smiling right now. See you in a couple days, Mom. At any rate, she gave the example of how many times people will say, I promise you tomorrow I'll take you to Disneyland. And she said, well, what happens if you intend to, but then the car breaks down, or then somebody gets sick, or, your boss calls and you got to run into work, and you promised this kid that you would do something and you didn't do it, and they don't understand extenuating circumstances. So they were very careful, saying, we will do the best we can to do this if at all possible. They always had kind of a weasel clause. But when you stand there at the altar, however, you're saying, I'm going to take you for better, for worse, for richer or poor, in sickness and in health. There's no weasel clause in that. And that's why it's holy matrimony, and that's why it's so serious. And so that's good advice, isn't it? Make promises sparingly. Don't overcommit yourself. Keep them faithfully. So, yes, Chase.
It says that yes be yes, and your no be no. Wouldn't it just be there's really no promises to be made? Your word is your promise?
Well, yeah, I think Jesus is saying that, the Jews had this idea that, kind of like in our culture, you're trying to really emphasize you mean something, and you'll say, I promise on my mother's grave, that this is true, or cross my heart and hope to die, dumb things like that, Then if you're, going like this, it didn't count, because you had your fingers crossed. You kids have always played those silly rules. Well, they've always had that. And Jesus said, none of that stuff, none of this where you swear by the temple or you swear by this or that. If you say something, my dad used to say in his day that it says your word is your bond. It used to be a handshake. You could count on someone's integrity. And now you got to get everything in writing and everything detailed and have your lawyers look at it because nobody trusts anybody anymore. Yeah, exactly right. Better watch it because, this thing goes sour. You better look at the fine print. And Jesus is saying, as a Christian, you don't have one set of rules where most of the time people can't count on what you say, but occasionally when you really swear, now you mean it. He says, I don't want you to swear. Not by the temple, not by this, not by that, not by your mother's grave. Just be the type person, you're careful what you say, and when you say it, you mean it, and people can count on your word. I think that's one of the ways that Christians ought to be seen as better and different from their counterparts in the world. And part of that is think twice before you say yes or make a commitment. Don't be rash with your mouth, lest you wind up looking like a fool.
That's holy living.
Yes, that is holy living. Okay, let's look at chapter 12, a ruler in defense. And these Ephraimites, who else did they give trouble about a war that they weren't called to or didn't get their spoils that they thought they deserved? Remember back with Gideon? It says, chapter 8 and verse 1, And the men of Ephraim said unto him, Why hast thou served us? And thou callest us not when thou wentest to fight with Midian. He goes, they find out they've had this great victory, and they act like, well, we want in on this. We want the glory. And Ephraim was, by power and population, one of the primary tribes of ancient Israel. In fact, oftentimes Israel is just referred to as the stick of Ephraim. It's where the part stands for the whole. So these guys didn't like being left out, and I really like the way Jephthah calls them on this. He says, why didn't you call us to victory? And he says in verse 2, he says, when I called you, you saved me not out of their hand. In other words, I did call you, and you didn't come. And now that we've had the victory, you're acting like I didn't call you. And I did. And so, no, you don't get the spoils of war because you didn't show up and you didn't risk your neck and you didn't have faith like you should have. And so, while Jephthah's response to the Ephraimites may not be as diplomatic as Gideon's, it must be remembered that Gideon was not threatened like Jephthah was. They were so mad. What were they originally going to do to Jephthah, who just spared them from the Ammonites? He says, we're going to burn thy house upon thee with fire. So upon thee sounds like we're going to wait till you go back home and then we're going to light your house on fire with you in it. Not a lot of diplomacy in that. I mean, this is a terrible threat, and the similar kind of statement is made in verse 4. So they're downright hateful, doesn't leave much room for negotiation, as Gideon did with them. And assuming Jephthah's statement to be true, that they did not respond to his call to arms, then their attack on him was really nothing more than greed for the spoils. and I think maybe some ego that they wanted a part of this victory. And even if what they said was true, it was not justification for their actions. And it's not at all trusting in and being thankful that God had used Jephthah. So once again, it's all just division and fragmentation and every man doing that which is right in his own eyes. So they have this, they wind up having this battle. And of course, an Israelite looks pretty much like an Israelite, except they had trouble pronouncing, I guess, the LEs. I had a friend, Doug Nerlin, he always said XYZ. He was from Canada. And in Canada, you say XYZ. And I used to argue with him, XYZ? What is wrong with you? It's XYZ. He goes, not my country. It's not, And so I guess if you caught somebody saying Z, it's a Canadian, right? It's kind of what's going on here. They couldn't pronounce something. Yes?
I once knew a gentleman from South Korea. He was over here for business for 3 or 4 months, and he had a terrible time with the letter L, pronouncing words that start with the letter L. My name is tough on him.
Thanks, Est. That's a good example. Yes, Todd?
You just think of like the Tulalip tribes and Puyallup. I mean, people have difficult times in pronouncing those things, so this makes sense.
Yeah. When I first moved up here, I had a real, what is that? Puyallup? What, Edom Claw, I was listening to an earlier sermon I did, and somehow or other I was mentioning places around here, and I just butchered every place I mentioned. That's just embarrassing thinking about it, because everybody else knows the way it's supposed to be pronounced, but you're a newcomer and you don't, right? And so, anyway, that's a little interesting situation where they caught a bunch of these people, and 42,000. And so then it talks about some other fellas, Ibzan, who was from Bethlehem, of course, where Christ was from, 30 sons and 30 daughters. And he judged Israel for 7 years, and he was buried in Bethlehem. And then this fellow Elon, he's from Zebulun. He judged Israel 10 years, and he was buried in the tribal inheritance of Zebulun. And then Abdon, he was the son of Hillel, and he had 40 sons and 30 grandsons, all who rode on donkeys. Good for them. And he judged Israel for 8 years, and he was buried in Ephraim. And so there's just a list of these other guys that sort of God used to help them have peace.
Why do we have to know they rode on donkeys?
I don't know.
Well, isn't that kind of a status?
Well, I think the idea is they had animals they didn't have to walk, I guess. I don't know. I wouldn't think a donkey something to brag about. But that was the day that they were in. Okay, let's go on, and let me, in the next 3 or 4 minutes, let me just introduce a little something about Samson for us to think about, and we'll pick this up in 2 weeks. What do we know about Samson? Well, I think names are significant. I think certainly Samson's name is significant. Anybody know what Samson's name meant? Preached on this a couple of times here. The name Samson meant strength like the sun. He was like the strong light. He was from the tribe of Dan. And he was from a hometown nearby, and his father's name was Manoah. And he became a Nazirite for life before he was even born. What does that mean? Number 6 talks about a Nazirite vow. Yeah, the idea behind the Nazirite vow is that generally you do it for like a week or 2 weeks. A month was very typical. And during the time that you're doing this vow, you wouldn't shave your beard, your mustache, your eyebrows even. It says, you don't cut your hair. So you'd stand out as being different because the average Israelite is supposed to be well kept. And that meant that you were doing something special in this Nazirite vow. Well, in this case, he's designated as a Nazirite for life. And so that's very unusual. Who else is referred to as a Nazirite in the Bible?
John the Baptist.
Yes, John the Baptist. Yes.
But also their beards are just larger than life as well.
Well, yeah, they wouldn't cut their beard. So when you picture Samson, he would have been someone that didn't trim his beard. There were provisions in the law for specific ways they were supposed to trim their beard and have them nicely. You would qualify, Chase. You're in good shape. All right. And while his mother was barren before he was conceived, she later had sons, and he was buried in a special place in his father's tomb. Now, what previous judge dealt with the Philistines? Shamgar. Remember Shamgar killed 600 Philistines with an ox goad? All right. How was Samson a microcosm of the nation of Israel? Let me conclude with this thought. He was miraculously birthed from one who was barren. He lived among the Canaanites and was corrupted. He suffered from sin. Sin binds, grinds, and blinds, as we see in the life of Samson. And then he's going to be taken captive because of his sin, rejected by God, but later restored and used by God through his death to have great victory. So I think that's pretty cool. He's kind of a microcosm of what's going to happen to all of God's people. So next week, pick up with Micah and his unique apostasy. Les will cover that. And then we'll spend the next week or so talking about one of my favorite Bible characters, Samson, man that was very strong and very stupid. Especially when it came to Delilah, right? Yes. Yeah, he couldn't drink any wine. Yes. No raisins. Yeah, and he wasn't supposed to touch any dead body or corpse, which he violated very early in his life with the lion. Okay, thank you all. I really love this study and appreciate your comments very much.